Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA, episode 51 for the week ending May 5, 2017, the Cinco de Mayo edition. Over some breakfast tacos and Mexican coffee, Jay and I have a wide-ranging discussion over some of the week's top compliance and FCPA-related stories. We discuss the article in the FCPA blog on why due diligence investigations still need the human element. We discuss the rationales for anti-corruption legislation, including the FCPA and how Uganda has now considered a demand-side response to corruption. We discuss Cara Brockmeyer's moving to Debevoise and Plimpton in the private sector. We take a look at an article by James Stewart in the Common Sense column in the New York Times about what has been the fate of whistleblowers at Wells Fargo. We discuss the Astros leading team this year. That's American League leading record in baseball, and discuss the NBA playoffs, considering what Tony Parker's injuries might mean for the Spurs Rockets playoff series. We talk about the Financial Reporting Council investigation of KPMG over its audits for the Rolls-Royce audit and the firm's failures to detect bribes paid by the company. We also discuss the Compliance Week 2017 conference that I'll be moderating a panel and speaking at. Listeners of this podcast can receive a discount to Compliance Week 2017, and I will link to that discount code in the show notes. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening to This Week in FCPA. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I would like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA, episode 51 for the week ending May 5, 2017, the Cinco de Mayo edition. As always, I'm joined by my cohort and co-host, Mr. Monitors himself, Jay Rosen. Jay, welcome.
Thank you, Tom. Buenos dias. It's 7 o'clock here in Los Angeles and 9 o'clock in Houston as we're taping this morning. And thanks for joining us. Take a look at This Week in FCPA.
Well, Jay, we had, I thought, a pretty interesting week. Lots of different things kind of came up. So maybe we can just set aside our breakfast tacos and Mexican coffee and dive right into it. I'd like to start off with Cara Brockmeyer, our friend from the formerly heading the SEC's FCPA unit. She announced she is going to the law firm of Debevoise and Plimpton in Washington. A great move for the firm to bring Cara on board. But there was one thing I really wanted to highlight other than where she landed for our listeners, Jay, and it said in the article by Dick Casson in the FCPA blog that she will be a member of the White Collar Regulatory Defense and then the Crisis Response Group. And I found that last component quite interesting, Jay. Many companies will have a crisis response group. Certainly, you've worked in a crisis industry, the motion picture industry, so you're probably somewhat familiar with that. But typically, you see that in a corporate setting or a PR firm, and here we have it within a law firm. So I thought that was really forward-looking to bring her into that, and having a law firm who can be part of a crisis response group, I thought is really an innovative technique. Or service, rather, that a law firm can provide, and certainly something that in this day and age, companies should have. So really, any thoughts on that part of Cara's move?
I agree with you, Tom, that it is pretty forward-looking. And, you know, over the years, you and I have spoken about that. You don't want to be blindsided when a crisis comes along. So you should have a short list of folks that you're going to get together. So it's almost part, of a business continuity plan. So I applied Debevoise for bringing her in. And the other thing I wanted to note is there's a very high SEC alum factor there. Mary Jo White is there, along with Andrew Seresny. So it's kind of like you watch a coach move around and bring some of his key players with him. So it's I think it's nice to get a group back together, and I think this hiring of Cara really does strengthen Demo Voice.
And just to plug Compliance Week 2017, at the end of this month, Jay, I am actually moderating a 2-person panel, which will include Cara, also Ren McEachern from the FBI. And I'm certainly going to add this to my list of questions on the crisis response component of her practice going forward. So if you're going to be at Compliance Week, you check out that session. I think we're on Monday afternoon. And for listeners of this podcast, you can receive a discount for the registration fee, which we will link to in the show notes. Jay, from across the pond, we had some interesting news around Rolls-Royce, which, of course, is sustained the largest fine under the UK Bribery Act. But the Financial Reporting Council in the United Kingdom said it is investigating following the SFO announcement of the DPA between United Kingdom government and Rolls-Royce relating to offenses of conspiracy to corrupt and failure to prevent a bribe. So basically, the auditor, the accounting regulator, rather, in the United Kingdom, has opened an investigation into the audits that KPMG did for its longtime client, Rolls-Royce, basically to try to determine why the auditing firm did not come up with information about the bribes and bribes paid by Rolls-Royce and corruption that they engaged in China, Indonesia, India, Malaysia, Nigeria, Russia, and Thailand from 1989 to 2013. So that's really an interesting development now when you have the auditing regulators starting to look at the auditors of companies that engaged in truly massive bribery and corruption schemes. Certainly we had that type of scheme in the Odebrecht case. We may have that we had that in the Avon case. We may have that in other cases that are currently under investigation, and one wonders if the PCAOB or other regulatory body here in the United States might begin to take a look at the auditor's roles in failure to detect evidence of bribery and corruption. I would note that KPMG said in a statement yesterday that it is important regulators acting in the public interest should review high-profile issues. We will cooperate fully with the FRC's investigation, which follows the SFO's investigation into Rolls-Royce. We are confident in the quality of all our audit work we have completed for Rolls-Royce, including the 2010-2013 period, which the FRC is considering. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out going forward. Jay,
I guess.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that this is a NESM issue that is not a one-off. But I guess the one thing to consider is if a company is in there doing audited financials, they're only going to be able to recognize what is being shared with them. So it's almost that chicken and the egg thing that they're in there. Trying to certify financials. They're not in there trying to root out corruption. So it's, if it's sausage in, it's sausage out. So I'm not really sure how much you can expect. In the past, I think there have been some whistleblowers that have come from the audit side. So this might be a situation that doesn't argue for deregulation, but I think it might, as you're suggesting, it might actually bring on some more regulation based on how this matter plays out.
Jay, next we had a very interesting article by our friend and colleague Scott Schaefer from the Kreller Group. He's the managing director at the Kreller Group, and he wrote a very interesting blog post in the FCPA blog entitled Due Diligence Still Needs the Human Element. And I was wondering if you really had any thoughts about this, because I found it to be just a very interesting post.
Yeah, Scott and his team at Kreller are wonderful. And this comes back to one of the things that you like to quote, trust but verify. And there seems to be such a push to productize due diligence and to make it so easy so you can press a button and get it on your desk and say, okay, no red flags here, let's move on. And Scott makes a very good point that there's only so much you can get from the known databases and from, computer services, that at some point, if you need to decide a go or no-go situation, or if you have to decide, do you want to bring this person on as a third party, there is nothing that will take the place of in-person due diligence. And I think it's a very eloquent piece. It's very straightforward, and it really, paints the perfect case on why you still need to have a human element involved when you're doing due diligence. And that especially is true when you're dealing overseas in countries where we do not really have an understanding of how things work. And by using the quote boots on the ground there that Preller has, they are able to really use their subject matter and their country matter expertise to produce superior due diligence results.
There was a couple of things that really kind of caught my attention about his article that I wanted to relate to our listeners, Jay. The first one, he said that raw data has limited value if not presented in an easy to digest, logical manner following a thorough analysis. Then he went on to say, a review may uncover red flags which require research beyond the original scope of the work. Indeed, red flags which would not be uncovered through an automated process, and really then leading to what I thought was, it seems obvious, but still a good insight to recall. To thoroughly research an international partner, local investigative sources must be utilized because of the lack of either database access or even in some cases having a database that you can access in places outside the United States. And it really speaks to the need to have a trained professional who can look at these issues, look at the information, look at the data, present it to you as the customer or client in a way that allows you to either ask questions and make further inquiry or incorporate it directly into your decision-making calculus of your risk ranking, because at the end of the day, it's going to be the responsibility of the company to accurately assess the risk, rank the risk, and then manage that risk. And I think what Scott's telling us is that, yes, you can get lots of good information, and we both have worked with and know companies that can provide some automated due diligence that is very useful and very helpful. But it's not going to really get you to the level you need to do, particularly outside the United States, which, of course, is where the FCPA applies to. Companies doing business outside the United States, to foreign government officials and employees of state-owned enterprises. So, it may sound, if you and I were just somewhere talking about that, you and I just might say, well, of course that's true. But I really applaud Scott for his blog post and reiterating what you said and what you and I really understand to be the situation is you've got to have a trained professional not only looking at this information to assess it, but you've also have to have a trained professional to know the questions to ask and then the follow-up questions. So raw data does have value, but you've got to know how to look at it, how to analyze it, and then how to present it to a client who can then make the appropriate risk assessment in the scope of an overall risk management assessment or strategy.
So kudos to Scott. This appeared in the FCPA blog this past Wednesday, and we will definitely include the link in our show notes.
Jay, I don't know if you were able to get to the New York Times yet today, but there was a pretty scathing article by James Stewart in his Common Sense column. Typically that appears on Saturday, but it appeared today on Friday. And he took a look at the the Sherman and Sterling report to the board of directors at Wells Fargo on their fraudulent account scandal. But he looked at it from the whistleblower perspective. And he really the title says it all. They exposed a scandal, but merited just a footnote. and his reference in the title is literally to that reference. There was a footnote reference in the, I think, 110-page report of the whistleblowers issues. And he quoted or cited to Hal Jackson, a professor at the Harvard Law School, which said that that's a red flag in and of itself. And that footnote is buried on page 87, and his concern is whether the whistleblowers were handled properly and to what degree the board bears responsibility for this. And then he quoted Brandon Garrett, of course, who's well known in the FCPA world, author of the book Too Big to Jail, How Prosecutors Compromise with Corporations, who said that to have a systematic pattern of misconduct on this scale, you need to make sure that potential whistleblowers are kept quiet. He went on to say that a bad compliance system is one thing, but if people knew there were problems and were silenced, that's much more serious. James Stewart, in his article, cites people who were silenced and what was the culture that allowed whistleblowers really to be stifled at Wells Fargo. He cites a couple of other cases, recent cases, where whistleblowers have had difficulty, or the issue has had difficulty, but the Wells Fargo case, I think it's really going to be telling how Sherman and Sterling comes out on this. If they whitewash the whistleblowers and say there was no evidence of retaliation, I think it's going to take away from the really comprehensiveness of their overall report going forward. So we'll have to see how that plays out. I'll link to this article. It's in today's New York Times. It's really an excellent review of where we might be on whistleblowers going forward. Jay, I'd like to now turn to something that struck my eye and something I've been thinking about and writing about over the past couple of weeks, and that is the rationale for anti-corruption, anti-bribery laws. Obviously, there was a reason that the FCPA was created back in 1977, and Congress laid out the policy goals for the enactment of the FCPA right in the preamble. The first was that the public revelation that at that time in the mid-'70s, over 400 U.S. companies had paid over $300 million to bribe foreign governments, public officials, and political parties. These payments were not only unethical, but counter to the moral expectations and values of the American public. Second was the revelation that bribery tended to embarrass friendly governments, and that means governments friendly to the U.S., lower the esteem for U.S. citizens for the citizens of the U.S. among other nations, and lend credence to suspicion sown by foreign opponents of the United States that American enterprises exert a corrupting influence on the political process. Finally, by enacting the FCPA, U.S. companies would be in a better position to resist demands paid to pay bribes by corrupt foreign governments, their agents, and representatives. This policy goal and rationale, I think, morphed a little bit after 9/11, when terrorism was seen as a natural outgrowth of bribery and corruption, and that one of the tools available to the Bush administration to fight terrorism in the wake of 9/11 was the FCPA, because of the direct link between corruption leading to crime and then to terrorism. Certainly, we've even had evolution since that time, and the fact that Trevor McFadden, in one of his speeches last month, said that corruption impedes free competition as it allows companies to provide substandard products and services to be awarded under contracts awarded by foreign governments and state-owned enterprises, and that the real losers of corruption are the citizens of those countries where contracts are awarded based on bribery and corruption, and that bribes actually impede economic growth, undermine democratic values and public accountability, and weaken the rule of law. So economic growth is clearly one of the reasons I think that robust FCPA enforcement is still in the cards. But what intrigued me was, Jay, we recently had a instance where a foreign government recognized that corruption within its borders was a killer for its own economy, and that country was Uganda. And Uganda's pretty well recognized as a high-risk country. It's had a score of 25 in the 2016 Transparency International Corruption Perception Index that brought it in at a robust 151 out of 176 countries listed. And we had the finance minister saying that literally corruption is a killer when it comes to promoting investment, and that the company has actually, country rather, has moved towards reducing corruption. And also they've done this in a very, I thought, comprehensive approach, is to do away with the Byzantine licensing and registration requirements. So, for instance, what used to take a month or 3 months rather to get a license to do business has moved up to literally 1 week. And to get goods in and out of the country used to take weeks as well. And that's periods moved up. And the problem is when you have long delays and multiple persons who have to approve licenses, registration, imports, exports, you have potential for lots of people having their hands out. So I thought it was very interesting, Jay, that a country which is perceived to be quite corrupt, with lots of government officials with their hands out, really recognized how damaging that perception is, indeed that direct corruption is, to the country's economic benefit, and have taken steps to do it. So another way to look at it is a demand side response to bribery and corruption.
Yeah, it's you wouldn't normally think that solution would come out of a place with such a high CPI score. So it'll be interesting to see if there are other regions like that consider a similar response.
Well, Jay, I have to note for our listeners that the Houston Astros are leading the American League, although I still think it's an abomination we're in the American League. Nevertheless, there is where we are stuck. But we have the best record in the American League. Until last night, we had the best record in baseball, but still leading the American League, both pitching and hitting. We won 3 out of 4 games from our arch rival, the Texas Rangers, in the first half of the Lone Star Boot series between the Astros and Rangers this year. So always good to beat the Rangers, and certainly good to be in first place. I will have to admit that I've not heard a lot coming out of New England about the Red Sox. Any thoughts on where they might be about now?
Well, you probably don't hear much from New England because there's not much to be saying about them right now. But if you listen to Buck Showalter and his Baltimore Orioles, which are in second place behind the Yankees, which is even more surprising. He's kind of characterized the Red Sox as belly whiners who are really, they got the flu and they can't play baseball. I think the East is shaping up to be very interesting. It's nice to see this division be competitive. When you look at it, Baltimore actually has the most wins in the 4-year period. The Yankees have a great closer. They have this guy who is 6'8", who's swatting homers every other day. So until the Sox get over the flu, get everybody out in the field, and get their pitching in shape, there's really not much to say. So all I can say is I'm thankful it's May 4th and not July 4th. So hopefully they can get their act together in the next month or so.
The recent series, the series that was recently concluded between those two teams, there certainly appeared to be some bad blood. So much to the point that the commissioner actually got involved and told everybody to calm it down. And my first thought was, I guess he wasn't watching baseball the last decade, was he? Seemed like to me there were some games where people didn't throw at their heads; they threw at their eyeballs. And I can think of a few times where the Yankees and the Red Sox probably needed to suit up with some football pads just to go out on the field against each other. And
it was even more crazy. I think that the real feud for several years ago was when they were still known as the Devil Rays, but there was stuff that went on for 2 or 3 years, and it's those unwritten rules of baseball are very interesting. This game has changed so much with the way athletes prepare and the supplements they can take, but it's very interesting that the codes still exist from probably 150 years ago, that if you hit a homer and if you take a couple minutes you take a couple seconds to admire your handiwork, or you do a bat flip, I don't understand why that necessarily determines that you're going to get beamed in the hip the next time up. But whoever came up with these unwritten rules, maybe that's one of the first places to start to police baseball.
And Jay, and the other sporting news of the week is that the Houston Rockets and San Antonio Spurs are locked in looks like it's going to be a pretty good series in the conference semifinals here in the West in the NBA. But Tony Parker had a pretty horrific injury, I think tearing a thigh muscle, literally off the quad off the bone, and he's out for not just a series, but 4 to 8 months at least. That I think is going to change pretty dramatically. Parker being the point guard and spark plug of the Spurs, and could really significantly change the series. Now, I recognize you're in Los Angeles, and really never heard you speak a whole lot about the NBA. Perhaps you have a little more love for the Celtics than you've ever let on. But here in Houston, and certainly in the state of Texas, people are following this series pretty closely. Anyone who might win this series is still going to have to go through Golden State, and that may be well nigh impossible. But the Rockets under Mike D'Antoni have really put together a strategy and built a team around shooting, and then shooting some more, particularly shooting threes. Whether that gives them a puncher's chance if they get through San Antonio on the way to Golden State, it's only to be seen. But things are looking interesting here in our Texas playoff series.
It's nice for you to have a little baseball rivalry, a football rivalry, and now an active NBA rivalry. You're right about basketball here in LA. When I moved out here in '87, I was still bleeding green Celtics blood and McHale and the Chief. But with the exception of the run 3 or 4 years ago, the Celtics have not really been top of mind. But I think one thing that merits some attention is, I believe, is it Isaiah Thomas, the Celtics point guard, that has been incredible over the past couple of weeks. He lost his sister who passed away, and when he's been on the court, he's really been able to focus, doing some work to keep his team competitive, to help them win Game 7, and to honor his sister. So I think that shows some of the healing power of sports.
Absolutely. He really has put together just a fabulous series, and it's going to be. I think it's going to be a great series. I think Washington with John Wall and Bradley Beal are going to be get competitive. They brought it back to 2-1 last night. So although the Celtics / Bullets, or Wizards. Sorry to go all retro there on you. Still have the biggest problem of all, because how do you get through King James and the Cleveland Cavaliers? But getting there, you don't have a chance to win in the conference finals unless you're there. So good luck to your Brad Stevens-led Celtics and Isaiah Thomas. Hopefully the Rockets can prevail and at least have a puncher's chance against Golden State, but it's going to be interesting to see where it goes. So, Jay, go ahead.
I was going to say, what airline are you flying on next week, and where are you going?
Actually, I'm at home next week. So it's my 1 week to be at home in the month of May. In third week of May, I'm, of course, in Philadelphia, putting on a conference on Tuesday, May 16th, with Jonathan Marks, a partner in Markham. And we're going to talk about operationalization of compliance programs, largely for internal auditors and chief financial officers. So I'll link to that in our show notes. If you're in Philadelphia and you'd like to attend, then I'm speaking at Pharmaceutical Conference with Ben Lachlan. We're going to take a look at some risk management issues, the risk management process, forecasting, risk assessment, and risk management going forward. Then the final week of the month, I'm up back for Compliance Week 2017. As I indicated that I'm going to chair a panel with Cara Brockmeyer and Ren McEachern. I'm also on a panel where we're going to talk about what the year of 2017 and the new administration have brought for ethics and compliance officers on a panel with Joe Mount and Bill Coffin from Compliance Week. I'm going to take a look at it from kind of the FCPA compliance regulatory angle. So if you can attend one of those conferences, I hope you will. And as always, until I change, I'm going to be flying on United, hoping they're going to ask to bump me and I can get a $10,000 award, or at least a recompense to be reaccommodated. So we live in hope.
So when you're in Philly, are you planning to go Geno's or Pat's?
I have told Mr. Marks that I am a wing aficionado, so I want to have some buffalo wings in Philadelphia to see if they can cook a proper wing there.
Oh, I was saying that there's the age-old battle between these two cheesesteak places,
yeah,
Geno's and Pat's and some, but you're just interested only in the wings.
Well, I've not had wings in Philadelphia, so I think I'm going to try to make that exploration this time.
And just a quick thing, what do you think about all the belly aching of those? Were they congressmen who were dressing down the airline industry the other day? Were those congressmen or senators?
Seems like, I can't remember. I think it was a House panel, but maybe it was. No, I think it was senators. Well, the airline industry really has a huge public relation problem, largely of their own making. And but I do want to give United a little bit of shout out because I think they moved quickly after their initial FUBARs around the passenger dragging off a plane incident. They have modified their internal controls to hopefully prevent that situation coming up again. They have changed the protocols so that they will not bump paying passengers for non-revenue staff members and employees to fly without some formal notification process. They will not bump or throw passengers off a plane after they've been seated. Gate agents now have more authority to try to entice people to be reaccommodated, and they've settled what could have been a very nasty lawsuit with the passenger who was physically dragged off the plane. One of the things that intrigued me, Jay, was there's an article in yesterday's New York Times about a situation that happened in Atlanta around Delta Airlines where literally the entire system went down. We all thought it was really weather-related, and that was the issue, but it turned out that Delta was not able to accommodate their own employees who could not get around information of where they needed to go and what they needed to do. So as something as simple as a phone call-in system crashed for Delta, and they could not communicate with their own employees to redirect their assets to try to stem a series of thunderstorms that went across the southeast, and east coast over a series of days in early April. So it really pointed up that you've got to consider your risks. So for an airline industry, they might think their risks are weather-related, properly so. They might think their risks are customer-facing and reputational, properly so. But when was the last time you considered how your employees communicate to you internally in a crisis, whether that crisis be a 9/11 type crisis, whether that crisis be a weather-related crisis, whether that be any other number of crises? And probably that's not been high on companies' lists as a risk to assess and manage, but it pointed out that you've really got to think through the process of your business process is literally that a process, and the same as compliance. Compliance is a process, so you need to go through and assess each step of your compliance program, see if there's first of all, test it, and then see if there's something missing that you could try to manage that risk before that risk really comes to the fore and your entire system crashes. So interesting news from the airline industry continues.
Yeah, so but that risk you're talking about there, Tom, is not a frontline risk where United could have done better, but that's actually a systemic risk, right? That they are so reliant on either technology or different ways to communicate that when it came down to this one situation, they really didn't have a way to handle it, probably because it was just on such a massive level of people they needed to loop back in.
Right. So coming from the Gulf Coast, where we have hurricanes from time to time, people tend to think about those things a little bit more. What are all of the implications of a catastrophic storm, and how are you going to communicate with your employees? So one time at Halliburton, for instance, I was instructed to prepare a crisis response to a hurricane that was heading towards Houston from the law department's perspective. And the first thing I had to do was get contact information. And when I went to people to get that, they, of course, gave me their cell phone. I'm like, well, that's not going to work if your cell phone is out or the cell phone towers. And so then they would give me their spouses. I said, well, they're probably going to be with you. What about your parents? What about your children? What about a relative? What about a close friend? How do you get in contact with someone during a true emergency if they're in the same geographic area with you where the emergencies occurred? And it took people a while to really even for that light to go off in their head that, I may have to give the name of an uncle who lives in Oklahoma, Colorado, or New Mexico and is not going to be affected by this hurricane. And that means I'm going to have to get in contact with him, to let him know or her know that I'm okay, and they can get that information to the rest of the family. So interesting way to have to look at things.
Yeah, well, it really does. It just shows you how broad-reaching all these subject matters are. And although, a name we're speaking about this week in the FCPA, there are so many examples that we see that are newsworthy or so many lessons that we can draw out of current events. So as always, Tom, it's great to speak with you on a Friday. You want to take us on home?
No, I'm going to let you do that. You're the take person.
I'm the closer. They got to play my closer's music in the background.
You need to get on behalf together for that, and I'll put that in when you give us the closing. So talk to Millie and Michaela about the theme that you want to have.
Okay. I will consult with my executive producers. So on behalf of Tom Fox, the compliance evangelist, this is Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitor, to thank you for joining us for This Week in FCPA as we take a look at all the happenings for the week ending May 5th. Thanks so much for joining us, and take care.
This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate us. It would certainly help our rankings and also get out the word about the only weekly podcast which relates FCPA compliance and ethics issues that's currently on the market. Also, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com and jrosen at jrosen@affiliatedmonitors.com. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you will join us again next week for another episode of This Week in FCPA.